Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on another series of the India Center seminar. And I would like to invite our director, Professor Pankaj Jain, to please introduce our guest.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. I'm really excited to introduce and welcome my colleague with whom I've exchanged emails over the years, but seeing him first time today, at least on camera, Professor Mrinal Kaul from IIT Bombay. And as I was seeing his CV, his bio, his journey apparently started from Pune, where we are right now at FAME University. From Pune, he went to Delhi and then to Oxford, then to Italy, then to Canada, and now back in India at IIT Bombay. Wonderful journey. And I'll read out his formal bio also, then he'll take over and we'll all listen to the great wisdom from Kashmir. Professor Mrinal Kaul teaches classical Indian philosophy at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the IIT Bombay, Indian Institute of Technology Bombay, IITB, Mumbai. His research focuses on the non-dual Shaiva philosophy. We know very little about it, I think, most of us. Particularly the 10th century philosopher Abhinavagupta, or in English Abhinavagupta, Gupta becomes Gupta. His recent publications include a preliminary note on the manuscripts of the Tantra Lok Vivek in Verita e Bellezia Essays in honor of Raffaele Torella from Naples, Italy, 2022. And the next is there a South Asian poetics in a cultural poetics of Bhasha literatures in theory and practice, edited by E.V. Ramakrishnan from Orient Black Swan in Hyderabad 2024. And is reflection real according to Abhinavagupta, dynamic realism versus naive realism in Journal of Indian Philosophy, Springer 2024. A volume titled Minor Works of Abhinavagupta, edited with Francesco Safera, is about to be published from Naples, also in Italy. And a new edition and translation of the Shiva Sutra Vimarshini of Kshemaraj with Ben Williams is in preparation. Most welcome, Professor Kaul, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Jan. It's a pleasure finally to meet you virtually, as you said. And thank you for offering me this platform to share some of the ideas or whatever I've been kind of working on for some time. So I will begin with an invocation as the tradition goes. I mean, whatever the idea of tradition means. So this is the first verse of the Ishvara Pratabhijna Vimarshini that Abhinavagupta writes. Nirabhasat purnatah miti purabhasayati yadvishakhama shaste tadanucha vibhanktum nijakalam swarupadvan Misha prasarana nimesha sthiti jushastadadvaitam vande paramashiva shaktyatmanikhilam. I pay obeisance to that non-duality, which is of the nature of the totality of the Supreme Self and its power. So, idea of subject and object, Shiva and Shakti, which originally manifests as I, because of being bereft of desire and being complete. And after that, willing to divide its own power into two, and which favors the manifestation, spreading, contraction from its own self. So with this verse, I begin, even though, of course, I will not go into the details of the Pratyabhijna syllogism per se. However, what I have tried to do in this short paper is to map an inquiry into how, if there is a possibility of trying to complicate and understand the principle of non-duality, according to Abhinavagupta. So I've tried to focus mostly on Tantra Loka and Malini Vijayavartika. So those mostly the whole text is based on that. I will not quote any Sanskrit text. I'll not. I think I'll read only few translations here and there because there is no much time. However, my attempt will be to try and propel, if there is a possibility of kind of, inquire, what does this really mean, this non-duality idea? The above invocation to non-duality by Abhinavagupta should compel us to think about mapping the problematics of this concept. What does non-duality mean? What did it mean in history? How did Abhinavagupta develop his system around this concept? And what does it mean for us today? The popular notion of non-duality in South Asian philosophy, call it Indian, call it Sanskrit philosophy, is sometimes vaguely generalized and can potentially obscure or influence our critical examination of this thorny problem of oneness. We have observed staunch non-dual philosophers like Shankara, 7th, 8th, roughly century, Common Era, meeting this fate in modern South Asia, even while the polemics of the principle of non-duality he developed are robustly coherent. Indeed, the history of non-duality in South Asian philosophy is eclectically complex. It demands addressing why and how the concept of non-duality evolved into a philosophical complexity, gaining the attention of the leading philosophical traditions of the world. Ironically, the South Asian context would require us to write a history of multiple non-dualisms. These non-dual systems should be seen as strongly competing with each other and as enormously contributing towards their mutual development over a longer period in history. Each of these well-developed non-dualistic systems competed with the other to establish a different or unique version of their own non-duality. And each developed a robust analytic apparatus arguing for it. Foremost amongst the Buddhists are the Yogacarans, i.e. Vasubandhu, for instance, 4th, 5th century Common Era, advocating the non-duality of consciousness. The linguistic monist like Bhartrhari, roughly again 5th century Common Era, advocating the non-duality of the word, and Advaitins like Shankara arguing for the oneness of the Brahman, the absolute reality based on the teachings of the Upanishads. These non-dual traditions developed in the history of South Asia into distinct and complex hermeneutic models pleading for non-duality and its ubiquity as the fundamental principle of everything. I mean, everything that whatever is. So ontologically speaking. Yet they staunchly stood firm, disagreeing with each other's definitions of non-duality. And that's why I said it demands writing history of non-dualities in the beginning, no? Each interpreted non-duality distinctly in consonance with metaphysical positions or philosophical doctrines they adhered to. What culminated into the non-dual philosophy of Trikashaivism or Pratyabhijna, represented mainly in the works of Somananda. Somananda is roughly early 10th century-ish, Utpaladeva, his student, mid-10th century-ish, and Abhinavagupta, so again, mid and later half of 10th or early half of 11th century, and Abhinavagupta's student Kshema Raja, so is 11th century-ish, was nothing but the further problematization of the perennially complicated relationship between the subject and the object, and their fundamental unitary nature. In other words, agent and agency, or the self and the other, or one and many, were argued to be a singular unifying category. They introduced these categories using strong metaphysical tropes like light, prakasha, and luminosity, or reflective awareness, vimarsha. While the Buddhists agreed to the notion of agency, but not the agent, the non-dualist Vedantins, on the other hand, argued for an agent bereft of agency. The Trikashaivism repudiated the tendency to give up either and argued for the inseparability of the agent and the agency. It must be said, however, that the backbone of this idea for Utpala and Abhinava, directly and indirectly, stood firm in the linguistic monism of Bhartrhari. In fact, I see the Shaiva non-dualism of Utpaladeva and Abhinavagupta as nuanced hermeneutics extending the philosophical core of Bhartrhari's linguistic metaphysics. In this paper, I'll exclusively focus on how Abhinavagupta interprets non-duality. In his works, Abhinava has emphatically argued for an absolute non-duality, paramādvaita, that encapsulates within itself both duality and non-duality, representing the higher subjectivity of the self. Using more contemporary terminology, I propose understanding Abhinavagupta's philosophy of non-duality as one term that can be used, pluralistic non-dualism or subjective pluralism. Two mutually opposing labels can also be used, like pluralistic idealism or idealistic realism. But what do I mean by using these terms? Probing into the concept of non-duality in a non-dual philosophy requires bringing the complete doctrinal system under a level of scrutiny. That is certainly beyond the purview of this paper. However, an attempt will be made to investigate this question. What did Abhinavagupta mean by non-duality, and what was unique to his multi-layered hermeneutics in developing an answer to this question? There is no direct answer to this question. First, we must explore the relationship between the two mutually opposing categories, like duality and non-duality, and ask if they indeed are mutually opposing categories, or if they should be understood as mutually augmenting or harmonizing categories. Strongly advocating the concept of universal sameness, samata, this non-dual system advocates a supreme non-distinction between the mutually opposing categories like purity, shuddhi, and impurity, ashuddhi, or total and not total, purna and apurna, unlimited and limited, aparichinna and parichinna, prescription and restriction, vihita, pratishidda, complete knowledge and limited knowledge, jnana and agyana, self and other, swa and para, or conscious and inert, chetana and jada. Further, we must ask, how is agency, kartrita, related to its agent, kartru? How is power, shakti, related to the potent, shaktimat? And how are these questions related to the problem of duality and non-duality? Unlike in the Advaita Vedanta, duality is not a term with a negative connotation in non-dual Trikashaivism. Non-duality has no status if the duality is negated. In fact, duality is the gateway to non-duality. Just as this dynamic empirical reality, what Utpaladeva calls Janasthiti, which we call our universe, as an our world that we are a part of, is the substratum of trans-empirical reality. Because of the dynamic potentiality or the luminosity, what I mentioned earlier as the translation of Vimarsha, of the everydayness of the human world, the potentiality of the unifying transcendental light, prakasha, also has to exist. I mean, that's the argument. If the world is, if the luminosity is, then the light also has to exist. If this is not the case, then ironically, the functioning of the human world will end. This is a strong proclamation made by Utpaladeva. Utpaladeva claims that there is no inherent ontic distinction between the transcendental reality and the reality of the human world. This transcendental I'm interchangeably also using for instance, what I'm calling the trans-empirical idea. This world of our experience is the subject. Now, that's something important to keep in mind. And we are the subjectified objects in this world. And from mutually opposing points of view, the trans-empirical reality is the subject, and the world is the objectified reality. Utpala argues for an epistemological model based on three fundamental concepts: knowledge, jnana, memory, smriti, and exclusion, apohana. That is potentially responsible for the functionality of this dynamic empirical reality. And yet the locus of all three powers, shaktis, is nothing but one. And this one that signifies for Abhinavagupta not numerical one, but the singularity, the singularness, or the only reality is defined by him as anuttara, absolute, supreme, unsurpassable. In the sections below, I have highlighted the facets of liberal hermeneutics which Abhinava uses to approach the issues of one and many. Abhinava's philosophical doctrine based on non-dual Shaiva metaphysics is intricately associated with this complex non-dual semantics that also paves a fertile ground for developing such liberal but methodical and coherent hermeneutics. If we adopt the Buddhist position of changing impermanence, or the Advaita position, Advaita Vedanta position of unchanging permanence, Abhinavagupta's view of changing permanence may be seen as an oxymoronic expression. Now, changing impermanence, for instance, the Buddhist point of view, Kshanikavada, the unchanging permanence, the Kutastha Nitya idea, and then Abhinava's, what I call the oxymoronic expression, changing permanence as Swatantrayavada. For at least epistemologically, the concept of permanence does not refer to a frozen constant in time, i.e., permanence is not antithetical to the idea of change, because when we say we cognize permanence, we are meaning to say that we are recognizing the dynamism present in the concept of permanence, where the dynamism is signified by change. This means that even the concept of permanence is subject to realizing the fleeting idea of time. When we attempt to understand concepts such as permanence, our cognitive self necessarily and paradoxically focuses on opposites of the categories being known. So when we ask, can permanence be permanent? Or can impermanence be permanent? Or also, is time permanent? This is similar to the idea that being can also be apprehended by reflecting upon absence of being, i.e., non-being. That lingers within the very notion of being. Even if expressions like fleeting permanence, absent presence, or absent being sound like oxymorons, their negative ontology cannot be denied. The idea of non-being is not that it is not, but that it very much is, i.e., the concept of non-being is always a manifestation signified by presenting, quote unquote, itself in mind. And it cannot be non-existent. I mean, after all, as the Yoga Vasishta claims, it is indeed possible to construe the universe of absences or negations. There's this famous story by the English title Three Non-Boys, and it's translated by Schulman by this title Three Non-Boys. And can you have the whole universe created out of absences? So being of non-being, that's the idea that I'm trying to kind of portray here. Non-duality for Abhinavagupta means recognizing the differentiated nature of a thing and bringing this to the fold of a single cognitive phenomenon of the knowing subject, who is unitarily able to cognize the difference between, let us say, a pot and a non-pot. Cognizing the difference between X and Y means establishing the relation between X and Y. Abhinava's position would be both being and non-being are, but also that their existence lies in their unity, i.e., the unifying agent. The essence of this idea of non-duality is paradoxically hidden in its multiplicity or plurality or duality. Basing his argument on the earlier scripture Bharga Shikha, Abhinava indirectly addresses the above dialectics in the Tantra Loka. He says, I read a small part of translation, it is neither being nor non-being. Neither it is both being and non-being, nor is it bereft of both. So he's indirectly basically targeting Nagarjuna. This state is indeed difficult to understand. What is this anuttara? Being in the world is the manifestation of this, i.e., idam, objective reality, which is delimited. It exists like a pot. But Bhairava is not like that. Bhairava for him is another name of this absolute non-duality idea. Non-being and not being manifest are in no case applicable to anything. But Bhairava is the life, namely the true existence of this universe. And his nature is only light, understand, prakasha. For these two reasons, Bhairava is neither of the nature of the two, nor bereft of the two. Since he is manifest in all forms, in what form should he be conceived? It's a kind of rhetorical question. Unquote the translation. These rhetorical questions deepen the paradox of binary non-duality. But it becomes clear that Abhinava is aspiring to build a category, or to say a meta-category, of non-duality, that is inclusive of both principles of duality and non-duality, and argues for the ubiquity of multiplicity. But how does multiplicity form the fundamental principle of unity? Since duality or plurality is inherently present in the unitary principle that cannot be negated, duality is fundamentally a part of non-duality. In Abhinava, the paradox of abandoning or agreeing gradually moves towards developing some dialectical unity of opposites. However, I argue this dialectical unity is not dichotomous, but circular. It is as if, like an Ouroboros, one end of the circle is the subject and the other end is the object. And there is constant revolving and moving from the positions of subject to object and object to subject. But this process is not unidirectional. In this dialectical circular unity, abandoning or agreeing become mere two potential possibilities depending on which side of the circle one is on. For instance, the pramata. No? This also means that the idea of subjectivity and objectivity, or what I also kind of, translate explaining presencing and withdrawing, is dynamic and not absolutely fixed in Abhinavagupta's non-dual view. So in other words, if one has to use pramata, prameya, pramana ideas, the valid means and the knower, the known, what I'm saying is that, of course, their internal position is fixed, right, from pramata, pramana, and prameya. But they can flip. That's what I'm trying to say in terms of that circularity. But in this process of emerging, unmesha, and dissolving, nimesha, the antinomies cannot be abandoned. The abandoning itself cannot be abandoned. And that's what I was arguing in the beginning, the idea that abandoning cannot be abandoned. The negation cannot be negated, or the absence cannot be absent. So to say something like negatum is to be negated will be a tautological statement. The very ontos of negatum means that something that is there to be negated, and it is Shiva in his metaphysics that is quote unquote negatum. Let us try to make sense of this. While cognizing a pot in front of me, I am also distinguishing it from all non-pots. And to distinguish a pot from a non-pot, I bring forth both of them together in a unitary substratum to distinguish them from each other. This unitary substratum unifies subjective awareness or consciousness, freely objectifying its subjectivity plurally. This unifying factor holds plurality together. In other words, to be free is to possess the potency of freedom. This freedom also represents the capacity to enact and inhabit restriction or dependence freely. This agency is not loaned, but self-generated according to him. In other words, it is the essence of the free agent or the self. And this is what Abhinava is referring to when he further posits in the Malini Shloka Vartika, the definition of non-duality. And he says, and it's an important verse because this is the translation, this is the definition of non-duality. So he says non-duality is referred to as where there is the indistinguishable manifestation of, and then there are these three sentences. So there is indistinguishable manifestation of this is dual, this is non-dual, and this is both dual and non-dual. So what he's saying is that where exists the indistinguishable manifestation of the three levels or three layers or three ideas, this is dual, this is non-dual, and this is both dual and non-dual, that is what I mean by non-duality. Unquote of the translation. In the above definition of non-duality, Abhinava argues for the indistinguishable manifestation amongst all states of reality. The phenomenon of manifesting is absolutely singular, even if there is embedded plurality in it. Unity has to be of plurality. Otherwise, there is no unity. To further explain, the problem Abhinava is proposing is that while cognizing a pot in front of me, I'm also distinguishing it from all non-pots. I'm trying to reiterate this because this is something important example, I'm repeating it. And while distinguishing a pot from a non-pot, I bring forth both of them together to a unitary substratum to distinguish them from each other. According to Abhinava, this agency, so this I have said, I think earlier, this agency is not loaned. This is absolute free power of the agent itself. So in other words, it can be explained like, for instance, giving an example of imagination. I'm not in here what I think Professor Jan had also, told me that I can try to bring in his aesthetic aspect as well. For instance, one can write a whole thing on that. What does non-duality mean from his aesthetic, the Kavya Shastric point of view, Natya Shastric point of view? But that needs completely another platform. So I have tried to avoid that here for the same reason. But to, for instance, see the idea of imagination is the potentially dynamic and free presencing of the mind. In terms of power and potent, Shakti and Shaktimat, Abhinava is not arguing for mutually opposing categories like a pot cannot also contain the absence of a pot, and the absence of a pot cannot also hold a pot simultaneously. Then how do we make sense of this non-duality? How does non-duality unify and encompass three opposing categories like duality, non-duality, and duality cum non-duality that he just said about in the definition? How does this unity accommodate plurality? What does a category defined as all-inclusive mean for him? This is not the non-duality Shankara is arguing for through a definition of the undefinable, like anirvachani idea, because nothing can ever be denied, like for Shankara. No, according to Abhinava, it's not possible to deny. Even the denial is the acceptance, because you're accepting the denial. And indeed, empirical reality is absolutely real for Abhinava. It is not Nagarjuna's dependent arising, the pratitya samutpada, because it does not mean that everything depends for its cause on another or that one is the cause of the other. But it does mean that everything is potentially of the nature of everything, which I'll come to just in another section. I.e., even a speck of dust potentially contains within itself the whole cosmos, subject to that potentiality being manifest unto or realized by the potent knower, the realizer, the agent. The problem is also that for the Buddhists, the phenomenon does not require a potential substratum. In contrast, the phenomenon in the non-dual Shaiva universe is such that the potent and potentiality are inseparable. This inseparability is further reiterated by the principle of harmonizing the mutually opposing categories, the principle of sarvam sarvatmaka for Abhinava. For Abhinava, this means irrespective of the distinction between purity or impurity, sacred or profane, i.e., literally every particle, whether feces, gold, iron, or diamonds, all has the nature of all. There is absolutely no distinction between a sacred stone considered to be imbued with the presence of God and a piece of feces deemed an object of disgust. They both share the same nature, either through their presence or absence, and being or non-being. It is nothing but the semantic power that offers the meaning of sacrality to the word sacred and also the meaning of profanity to the word profane. This universal subjectivity is translated into an idea of sameness, samata, in the Tantra Loka. The dialectics of this sameness does not function with the paradigm of the logic of binaries. then what is the logic of this principle of sameness? It creates a context in which the purest category could double as the most impure category, and the most impure category, the purest. The subjective purity can manifest or reflect itself within the purest or most impure objective reality, subjectifying it into the realm of singular universal purity defined by absolute non-difference between the limited domains of purity and impurity. What matters is the focus on the essence of being, of either purity or impurity, good or bad, God or non-God, duality or non-duality. Ultimately, it does not matter if one is settling one's mind upon either a pure or impure realm or object. But then, how do we make sense of this non-duality? Again, the question. How does this non-duality unify and encompass three apparently opposing categories? To come back to the question that I raised some time back. Abhinavagupta's version of non-duality implies the idea of inclusivism in the sense that for any concept of binary to manifest, someone must fundamentally recognize the distinction between the two opposite poles of this binary and unify them. For instance, it is the distinction, dvaita, the bheda, between a pot and a non-pot that unitarily brings a pot and a non-pot together. By saying this, Abhinava is not suggesting that there is the duality of the two, but he is saying that both of them come together as consciousness in consciousness. So that manifestation of them in the prakasha idea, the manifestation of them is singular. No? So they manifest in the prakasha form. And that manifestation is the process itself. Like, for instance, the idea of manifesting, the ing prefix. Like, what an example often I give is that there is no distinction for him between light and luminosity. Light cannot be separated from luminosity. Luminosity is just the dynamic form of the light. That's something. So the luminosity means nothing, just the idea of manifestation, the abhasa idea. Not the Vedantins' abhasa idea, but the Shaiva abhasa idea. What appear to be mutually opposing categories are components of a more significant mutual correlation and synthesis. These mutual opposites are in a sense interdependent, and they are also mutually anchored to each other, like knowledge and not knowledge are mutually dependent upon each other, or like a pot and non-pot are inseparably linked with each other. Such a connection would be impossible without a binary, without duality. But should we see a problem with binary logic? This deserves further explanation. For Abhinava, this universe of our experience is all that is. Thus, he introduces a teaching that may initially appear cryptic or unphilosophic, and therefore unconvincing. Our empirical universe is the universe of our experience, not only concerning our own experience, for instance, how we think, but also for our experiences of others. For instance, how we think the others think. All worldly transactions we undergo in everyday life are nothing but the unifying universe of our experience, of the self and the other. Moreover, it is the realm of the subject where the experience of both the subject and object, or the self and other, are brought into a synthesis. This leads to the conclusion that there is no fundamental distinction between the one and the many, unity and plurality, abheda and bheda. And this is the same dictum, for instance, if one goes by the textual references. This idea he is, from another point of view, he's bringing from the mother text, that is to say, this Malini Vijayottara Tantra, where one verse, in one line at one pada, says, Na dvaitam na api cha dvaitam. So, no duality, nor even non-duality. And then he explains that, for instance, in Tantraloka in detail, and then even in Malini Vijayvartika in detail. So I'll just quickly read the translation of the Malini Shloka Vartika, one verse there, which is explicating the same idea. Here there is no purity nor impurity, and no thinking of what is fit or unfit for eating, etc. There is no duality, nor even non-duality, and no prescription of worshipping, etc. of linga. Linga, by this he means there should be no prescription for physical ritual or ritual at all. But this skepticism of Abhinava is strategically mapping the territory of non-duality that is exemplified not only by the dictum of non-abandoning and non-acquiring, but also revertebrating with the relishing of aesthetically equiposed state of mind that is beyond the binary logic of epistemic reason. This is denoted by the injunctive phrase in one of the stotras, this Anuttarashtika. He says there in this one line, enjoy everything that happily there is. That is to say, there is nothing to do, nothing to abandon, nothing to acquire, but giving a kind of teaching, he says, enjoy everything happily. That is the highest state of the mind. Now, I don't want to explicate that idea because that will take further time, which is to be explicated through his aesthetic philosophy. No? Abhinava further elucidates the state of mutual opposites, or rather mutual synthesis in Tantraloka, where he equates this state with ultimate reality, anuttara, within the context of this idea of anupaya, that means without means. In this tradition of non-duality, nothing is prescribed or prohibited to be abandoned or acquired, i.e. there is no provision of injunction or non-injunction, vidhi or avidhi. So there is a beautiful explanation, rather a very robust explanation in some sense, in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, which is a very short, lucid commentary otherwise in 9.2426, where he very strongly, while giving an interpretation of this one term, avidhi, he means he's reinterpreting this idea and saying that everyone so far has misunderstood this word. Avidhi doesn't mean non-injunction. Avidhi means another mode. He literally uses this, by using another mode. And by saying that, by using another mode and explaining avidhi from this point of view, he's saying every mode is acceptable. There is no mode that is the corrupt mode. For instance, the earlier explanations have tried to interpret this avidhi as a corrupt mode. And he completely denies that explication, saying that no, it means avidhi means anyatha in the sense another mode. And anyone who is using any ritual, any worship, and so on and so forth through any mode is acceptable, because you cannot have denying, for instance, of any mode of let's say worship. For instance, worship for him is an epistemic, a cognitive act. Mode of duality is not a corrupt mode. It is just another mode, explains Abhinava, strongly advocating any mode as an authentic mode, provided they are non-dual modes. What one does becomes one's mode. So whatever you do, that's what becomes your mode. That's the idea. Even to be simply, or just simply being, is a mode, is a vidhi. This is why for Abhinava, there cannot be any prescription or prohibition. Prescribing and prohibiting would mean violating the freedom of the subject. Towards the end of the Malini Vijayvartika, Abhinava further strengthens this Catholicity of his non-dual hermeneutic, saying, and I quote my translation of the last line of the verse, the mode that is one's own, with which one worships their God, that mode itself has to be their ritual. There is no other way, unquote the translation. Abhinava is offering meta-meaning to the duality of impurity and purity, i.e. one may worship an impure God through impure means, which a pure or impure God has to accept. In the Tantraloka, Abhinava says, and I quote the translation, my own translation, this union and disjunction of purity and impurity of consciousness is because of the attribute of the knowing subject, unquote the translation. And to this, his commentator, Jayaratha, adds, again, the quote of translation, "This is why the purity and impurity are not fixed. What is impure for one can be pure for someone else, and vice versa," unquote. Jayaratha further clarifies elsewhere, and again the translation, "There is the division of purity and impurity everywhere as a result of union and disjunction with consciousness," unquote. Here, Abhinava is creating a robust platform for the pure practice of subjective freedom that is rooted in non-duality, mapping the path of universal sameness, the samarasata or the samata. This interpretation of non-duality is unique and philosophically provocative. I have a couple of sections. I think I'm short of time, so I will skip this one section and jump to another and then conclude. For Abhinava, the empirical world itself is a unifying factor. It brings us together and is the cause of unitary subjectivity. The world is the subject, and I am objectified into this phenomenal world through my experience. So it would not be wrong to call this system a pluralistic non-dualism, where non-duality's potentiality, the shaktata, the shakti of that, is hidden within an inherent pluralism. It is the same non-dual principle that is also interpreted through non-dual devotion, the advaita bhakti, or the sameness, as I said earlier, the samata, or that sometimes is explained using the metaphor of the mirror, the darpana nagara nyaya, the plasma of a peacock's egg, the mayuranda rasa nyaya, or the seed of a banyan tree, the nyagro, the bija nyaya. The potentiality of the potent or the luminosity of the light or the agency of the agent is a further way of explaining this unitary principle. It is impossible to see myself in a mirror unless I'm willing to see myself in a mirror. And I, of course, enjoy or dislike seeing myself in a mirror. It's based upon my freedom. Of course, not seeing myself in a mirror is also my freedom. Self-seeing is impossible without the mirror. For the self to reflect upon itself, that self requires an other to effectively mirror the self. Otherwise, self-reflection is impossible. The flip side of this oxymoronic non-duality is that the self others itself for self-reflection, because the self is self-conscious and does not depend on anything other than itself. In other words, the self becomes its own other, and the other is nothing but its own self. In response to the objection that is raised in Malini Vijayavaktara by himself, he says, and I quote my translation, "If sentience exists in the way described as the essence of a homogeneous awareness of being, then how do you explain that what I, who am manifold, do or know is not also generally done or even known by all the others? How do you explain that?" Unquote the objection of Abhinava, and he replies to himself, his own objection that he raises. In our system, and this is simply, just hitting the nail on its head. He says, in our system, own and other do not exist. Reality is indivisible. The fact that I perceive means that the characteristics that form a part are manifest. As has been said before, various manifestations appear in the highest light. The unitary state of light and luminosity is a meta-category where unitariness is defined in constituting its so-called binary nature. Yet, it is characterized by something beyond binaries. This unitary nature is located nowhere else but within the binary itself. So he would say, in Malini Vijayavaktara, we certainly do not teach non-duality by contradicting the acceptance of duality. If this agrees with your doctrinal position, that is to say, opponent's doctrinal position, the duality is absolutely clear. I do not need to explain that further. And elsewhere, giving a very taunting, kind of unhesitatingly taunting philosophical argument to his opponents, he says, and I quote my own translation, "Indeed, even if duality is such, so be it. We are not longing after words. Let it be so. For we do not abandon or accept things the same way you do. If you are desirous of reposing to the side that bestows grace on all, then you should take the vision of the supreme non-duality as your great refuge." So in other words, it's metaphorically saying that, well, I mean, unless you accept the non-duality principle that I am trying to kind of argue for, then your system remains incomplete. Otherwise, there is no problem with what you are saying. Non-duality is the dynamism exercised through plurality. Free will is nothing but reflective awareness, the creative capacity that has the potential of subjectifying the object and objectifying the subject. This involves turning subject and object into one reality, or having fused them, redividing them into two. This is the essential characteristic of the agent's agency, according to Abhinava. So now I have just one small paragraph to conclude. To argue for maintaining non-duality as a fundamental principle of a philosophical tradition is challenging. Still, Abhinavagupta evolved this challenge by advancing the Shaiva metaphysics into a coherently complex but powerfully liberal hermeneutics. So much so that his inventiveness is conceptualized into an all-inclusive non-dualism that he characterizes by not only developing significantly diverse but also mutually opposing concepts. For instance, this inclusive non-dualism is described in the Tantra Loka chapter 35, arguing that all Shastric systems have a fundamental unanimity, what he calls confluence of the Shastra Melana, that he elaborates using the concept of established well-known usage, which is a translation of prasiddhi. It is also represented by the authoritativeness of all the scriptures, the sarvagama pramanya, and mutual synthesis of all the scriptures, the sarvashastra ekavakyata. These are his terms. This established well-known usage, prasiddhi, functions as a synthesizer of posterior with prior. It is due to this usage that all worldly transactions are possible. For Abhinava, agama, which is another way of explicating this idea of prasiddhi, is single. And all philosophical systems inherently present a unanimity, even though they do so differently. And he does not see a problem with this contradiction. Targeting a specific tradition of Advaita Vedantins who argue for the variegatedness of Brahman. So now I'm invoking his grand teacher, Somananda. He asserts that the kind of variegatedness that one finds in the non-dual Shaiva system cannot be found in any other philosophical system. So this is kind of self-appraisal. He further taunts them, these Advaita Vedantins who are seen as this variegated, who are seen as the Chitra Brahma Vada, who propagate. He further taunts them, saying, by what reason can the variegatedness of one become that of Brahman? Since variegatedness signifies a dynamism absent in Brahman. Therefore, this absolute non-duality is named, now he is coming to his own system, this absolute non-duality is named Bhairava. And then what is important, I think here, why I wanted to end with this, is that the term he uses, and he uses this term in Sanskrit, Chitra Paribhasana Shilaha. This is Abhinava's term in Malini Shloka Vartika. Therefore, this absolute non-duality is named Bhairava, whose nature is to manifest multifariously and who is defined by oneness and manyness. This is the dynamism of the freedom, swatantra, of the agent, whose agency is equally manifest in both self and the other. So with that, I end. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for really illuminating talk. It was like full of quotable quotes and subjectifying the object, objectifying the subject, and so on. Really learned a lot. I guess let's invite questions, Sanjay. You can.
Yeah, we already have one question. I'll just read it out. So Sunil Kumar is asking, in a historical sense, what is the origin of Kashmiri Shaivism? Was it extant since Vedic times or derives from the Atimarga or Kapalikas or Pancharatra, etc.?
Okay, so the first thing I should say is I don't know if I created some level of this polemics if it was not understand. I tried to make it simple because see, it's to read the text, translate them, and to kind of like bring them to discussion. It's a tedious task, but I tried my best. But I don't know if it was easily comprehensible. If not, I apologize for that. This question is more historical. Now, one can approach, I mean, it's not in the context of the talk, because the talk was more kind of like, from philosophical point of view. However, if one has to, I mean, I simply would refer to the works of Professor Alexis Sanderson, because there is a lot of detail one can say. One point, I never use the term Kashmir Shaivism because I think, even though it's a very popular term nowadays, and it mostly refers to the non-dual Shaiva system, yet from many points of view, it is misleading. Why? Because one is that, of course, all the authors come from Kashmir, but then, you can have the same geographical adjective used for all the Kavya Shastrans who also come from Kashmir. The Vaiyakaranas, some of them, many of them who come from Kashmir. The Nayayikas, Jayanta, the logic school, and so why only reserved for Shaivas? The other point, important point, is that it is, I think, an injustice to exclude the Shaiva Siddhantins, because there was a robust Shaiva Siddhantin, the dualistic tradition also in Kashmir, who, like Narayana Kantha, Ramakantha, who were also the contemporaries of Abhinava himself or Utpala. It's just that we shamelessly do not pay attention to them, and then, we fashion Abhinavagupta so much that, okay, this term becomes a kind of more fashionable term. And then other historical reasons, one can go in the detail and so on and so forth. However, now to say that Kashmiri, there is the problem of the term, because prior to 9th century, roughly 9th and early 10th, you have a staunch and strong presence of the Shaiva Siddhanta, the Shaiva dualism in the valley, if one has to go by the geography of it. And then this is also an important question, that what happens in the history that there is this evolution of non-dualism, which begins with Shiva Sutras, Pandakarikas, and then Somananda comes into picture. There is the whole establishing of the Pratyabhijna literature, parallel epistemologically countering Buddhists, and parallel development of the whole Agamic tradition, where then Abhinava plays an important role. If one goes by the idea of valley, does it go back to the Vedic times? These are complex questions. I mean, what does it mean? I mean, do we mean there are Vedic relics? And because this becomes a complex question, no? However, if one has to say that, going by the doctrinal position of the dualistic Shaiva Siddhanta, it is true that they accepted the Vedic doctrinal ideas, more or less, which gradually in the non-dual systems, of course, even though the non-dual system is, it's completely based on, in its ontology, on the dualistic systems, yet at the same time, there was there was kind of moving away from the very Vedic ritualistic idea. Now, that's again complex. Say, for instance, none of these non-dual Shaivas would ever say that or will have some kind of detesting for Upanishads. No way. Because Upanishads, they understand as the texts of non-duality. So Abhinava, you would see he quotes from Upanishads all the time, because for him it is in a sense these are the Shaiva texts, like non-dual Shaiva texts. I mean, if he didn't write commentaries on them, but if I imagine if he would have time or something, he would have written commentaries, the Shaiva commentaries, non-dualistic Shaiva commentaries on Upanishads as well, because that's a fertile ground, as we know. I don't know if I answered the question. The question again of the Kapalikas and Kalamukhas, that goes back in time in terms that where did this question of purity and impurity began? And the Atimarga, those somewhere in the beginning, it is, many of these practices, as argued and documented well by Professor Sanderson, some of these practices began in these cremation grounds. And that's why gradually in the whole theoretical corpus, there are these ideas of what does purity and impurity mean? What he deals with in the Tantra Loka then, and then, in basically in some sense, then you see what Abhinava is trying to do. He is accepting the physical ritualism of the early Siddhantikas, but also moving away for, of course, reasons from them and trying to kind of, mentate the idea of ritual. So this idea then, the moksha, if there is a definition of moksha, is possible, or the removal of this idea of mala, for instance, impurity, is possible mentally through the mentation, through jnana, for instance, not through karma, not through ritual, which the earlier Siddhantikas were, stuck to. So he moves, and there is a full, you can prepare this whole map, that why does he do that, how does he do that, and what are the arguments on the basis of which he tries to kind of. But he's inclusive. He would never say that, okay, this is stupid to do. This is, for instance, all the ritual. The whole Tantra Loka is mostly about ritual, of course. But he's also theorizing. He's spending enough time to theorize that ritual and bring it to this notion of, in a sense, critical thinking, trying to, okay, what does it mean? Ritual means what? And why is it ought to be done, and so on and so forth. Sorry if I took some time.
Yeah. Our colleague, Professor Tarini Avasthi, has a question. If you can unmute yourself, Tarini.
Or you could just read it out.
So she's saying, thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed this. There were a couple of terms that struck me. One is Sarva Gama Pramanya. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah, I can read it.
Which of course
I can
is
read it, which of course is important to Yamuna and local boy Jayanta. I like that expression, reflecting connections that people are thinking about more and more these days, which is in some ways at least partly an argument around text and eligibility and legitimacy. And so, okay, yes, being drawn at least primarily Mimamsa and also grounded in a particular approach to textual exegesis. Could you speak a little more to the way these terms are being employed by him and the way they fit in with his system? Yeah, so see, agama, now from this term, the sarva agama pramanya, for this one needs to understand his idea, his that whole hermeneutics that he develops over this idea of agama. So for him, as in generally this whole non-dualistic Shaiva accepts from epistemological point of view to say that that he accepts these three pramanas, the pratyaksha, anumana, and shabda. And shabda is detailed as the agama pramana, and there is where even the pratyaksha and anumana, to say that perception and inference are subsumed within this idea of agama. Why? Because one is that he would bring this idea of agamas from many points of. One is that what is already pre-established in the scriptural texts, that is to say these agamas and tantras and so on and so forth. But at the same time, to resurrect the idea into this epistemic category like apta, this idea of well-established usage. And that is what is fundamentally important. And that is what I was, if you subtly, I was trying to kind of suggest in the talk, that the very fundamental notion of the practice, the existing practice that there is, which is fundamentally important in terms of the empirical reality. The empirical reality for him is the subject. And I am saying that this empirical world is the subject, where we are the objectified realities. That is one side of that circular process. No, the another side is that I am the subject, and this empirical reality is the objectified reality. And fundamentally, the point is in the interaction between the two. That is one side of it. The other side of it is that because even though, of course, he is taking Buddhists to task, he's taking every system to task, philosophically speaking, yet he very subtly seems to suggest that all of these scriptures, all of these agamas and everything, they are all Shaiva agamas. They are, because, he cannot be excluding. He is arguing that all of them, if they are teaching even dualism, they're teaching dualism cum non-dualism and so on and so forth, they may be speaking from different points of view. That's fine. But they are all moving towards this idea of non-duality, because you have to have fundamental plurality, within these notions, within these. Otherwise, we cannot have the oneness. There is an interesting, definition, as you said, how we interact with these ideas today. For instance, in Mahabharata, one line, I'm forgetting, there is a definition of a muni or a rishi, and it says very clearly that, bhinna mata or bhinna mati, if I'm remembering correctly, you have to have bhinna mata and bhinna mati. That's how you are a rishi. That's how you are a muni. Otherwise, you become lakir ka fakir. You become like, okay, no, there is only one reality. No, it can't be. So by saying the sarva is being inclusive, and then agama, the pramana is of the practice of all of Jaina agamas, Bauddha agamas, Tantra agamas, Saura agamas, everything. See, sometimes I ask students to do this exercise. Say, for instance, if Abhinava was existing alive for today, how would he have responded to what came after him? For instance, let's say religious traditions or philosophical traditions that evolved after him, and how would he have responded to many of them? No. So you have to be very radical. Then you have to say all Christianity, Islam, everything is basically Shaivism, non-dual Shaivism, So he would argue for that. In how much I understand Abhinavagupta, he would say that these are all the pramanic traditions. And because they have been there, that is in itself the proof that they are all pramanic traditions. Sorry, if
There's another question from Professor Pranav. What is the relationship between Brahman and Jagat for Abhinavagupta? And what parts of Shruti does Abhinavagupta rely on to answer that question?
Now, Brahman and Jagat, he doesn't use the term, that's a Vedantic term from one point of view, but not strictly, because for all of them, Brahman is that he uses sometimes the term Brahman. But Brahman for them, all of them, is a kind of metaphor, in a sense, philosophical metaphor for absolute, the category of absolute. So now if I, let's say, if I dare to change the question, what is the relationship between absolute and the Jagat idea, this empirical reality? And if one tries to interpret Brahman in his metaphysical category language as Shiva or absolute Shiva, so on and so forth, the relationship, if one sees, I mean, in terms, if you say, what is the relationship, then you are fundamentally, invoking the problem of dualism, because then you are saying that there are two of them, and there is a relation, because a relationship is only possible between two, fundamentally. So then to say that this question, in a sense, philosophically speaking, doesn't arise for him. That is to say, in other words, that what is there, whatever is, and very perceptually, inferentially, shabdically, is Shiva for him, right? So then you have to understand what is the relationship between the world and you, let's say, if in Vedantic language we say limited being or jiva. It is subject to, see, because you are a part of the game, you are a part of this empirical reality. So you are no different from the absolute. Now, then, why am I a limited being? The idea, for instance, you see this theory of error, he explains as akhyati in the sense of apurna khyati. It is because of a certain delimitedness that you have forgotten your real nature. Now, forgotten means that you're not forgotten here. Idea is not that the memory idea. Here it is that you are not seeing the full picture, in a sense, which for him then becomes this idea of recognizing, not the cognition, but the recognition, not the jnana, but the pratyabhignana. That if you really understand the true nature, I mean, so-called whatever one true means, you understand that, then there is no apurnata, there is only the purnata. There is the totality of, so now this totality idea, in some sense, what I mean is you may be able to experience, know, feel the whole that there is, absolutely that there is in this pen. So be it. That is absolute category for you. That is Shiva for you. You may be able to do it within yourself. You may be able to see it in a bottle, in a computer or something, the total cosmos. That not in the sense of part and the whole, but because every entity, every padartha, so to say, is potentially nothing but absolute. So it's a matter of unpacking it. You don't need to you don't need to be omniscient in that sense, purnata, that I know everything. I mean, of course you can't, you can't be omniscient in that sense. But if through that one idea you are able to, somewhere what I'm suggesting, I think, which becomes more manifestly clear in terms of this experiential idea in his aesthetic philosophy, that idea of intensity, that idea of the intense knowledge, intense feeling, intense understanding. That is what it means. That if you are intensely identified with just this pen, that's it. You're not supposed to go anywhere, do anything, and so on and so forth. That is what it is.
Rajshri Vasudevan asks, Namaste, thank you for the clear exposition on Abhinava, which was at once erudite and comprehensible. Adding an input to the question asked, Kashmir Shaivism was a term coined by J.C. Chatterjee in his book in 1916, if I remember correctly.
To question asked, Kashmir Shaivism was a term coined by J.C. Chatterjee in his book 1916 probably was a reprint. Research department was established in 1911, and I think the book was probably out in 12 or 14. Maybe 16 was a reprint then. That is true. I mean, that is why what I said in the beginning, that this term fundamentally, somewhere I see it as a sort of local colonial construction. That this term, because when Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee was brought by the then Maharaja Pratap Singh to Kashmir to head the research department, which was established in 1907, he asked him to head it. It was there in some form earlier. These are more historical details. But J.C. Chatterjee, one question that I often ask, I have discussed in some articles which I have not published yet, but why did King Pratap Singh bring J.C. Chatterjee all the way from Bengal? There were local pundits there. There was Mukundram Shastri, who was a very erudite pandit who was equally qualified to head the research department. Why J.C. Chatterjee? Anyway, there could be many answers to that. I have tried to discuss it. But he was a very erudite, learned pandit. He had done his BA from Cambridge, Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee, probably one reason he was brought. And he made a blueprint of what to be published in this series and so on and so forth, what was popularly known as the KSTS, Kashmir series of Kashmir's series of texts and studies in Sanskrit, the Kashmira Samskrita Granthavali. And when he kind of, he studied the whole archival material, which was basically earlier studied and provided by Buehler, George Buehler. He studied them. There was nothing published by that time. He studied them in original Sharda script and original Sanskrit and tried to write this book. It was partly historical and partly philosophical. A wonderful book of its own time, but now, of course, it's a little outdated book, not a lot outdated, but very erudite book of its own time. And that was the first ever time when anything was written about quote unquote Kashmir Shaivism in English. And he named this book Kashmir Shaivism, and rest is history. So then you have everyone following basically the same term without trying to get into the rubric that what does it mean. And later, J.C. Chatterjee doesn't do that, but later with other people popularizing this term and so on and so forth, they started, which is what right now the idea is, that they started kind of identifying this term only kind of puritanically with non-dual Shaivism, which is why, I mean, I have problems with that term. So yeah, I mean.
The next question is from Dr. Prashant Dharmadhikari. How should we make Abhinavagupta relevant while teaching literary criticism and theory to English literature students?
How should we make him, you said relevant?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I don't know how to make him relevant. Relevant is not the, I mean, I don't know. I have myself taught for 6 years earlier in Manipal. I was teaching MA English and I was teaching Abhinavagupta literary criticism there. How to make him relevant is just by teaching him. I mean, not only him, but the whole the aesthetic tradition of South Asia. I mean, there are now a lot of works available in English in translations. I think it's not only about him, but the Sanskrit literary world, also non-Sanskrit in the sense like South Asian at large literary world, one has to pay attention to it. I think that's simply the simple point. I mean, one doesn't need to do anything, just pay attention to it, and one can see that. What I am against completely is doing these kind of very shallow comparisons, which, this whole comparative business on the name of comparative literature, doing Shakespeare and Bhavabhuti and so on and so forth. I mean, If they fetch anything for anyone, maybe let that be. But I think what is important is I have tried to argue that kind of very peripherally in this recent that Professor Jain mentioned in the beginning. This is there a South Asian poetics? What it ought to be? What does that mean to ask this question? South Asian poetics, the literality, the idea of very literality, the sahitasya bhavaha sahityam, the idea of vangmaya, something made of speech. What do these terms mean? Pollock has tried to discuss these ideas as well. And then it's simply, I think my simple idea is to engage with him. There is no mantra that, oh, one has to do this, one has to do this. One has to sit down, read, and engage. And I mean, the two things which are fundamental, one is, of course, his commentary on the Natya Shastra, which is more technical, long enough, and so on and so forth. But then you have the I translated in English as I, the Lochana on Anandavardhana's Dhanyaloka, the light of suggestion. So that's another important contribution. And I think for me, just to say this one point, since this is asked, somewhere, and I have tried to, in some unpublished articles, I have tried to argue for this. Somewhere, and I have learned this in a long time to read and stuff, with also the inspiration of one of my teachers, Professor Navjeevan Rastogi. Somewhere the kernel of the whole Abhinavan world lies in its aesthetics. I have argued also partly that, and not that me alone, Professor Torella, Professor Rastogi, they have also argued that something like a book titled like Tantra Loka, which is by his own submission a paddhati, which is a ritual manual, is fundamentally a book of aesthetics. And now, what does it mean, and what do I mean by that is something a point of discussion. Why do I need to understand ritual to understand what does the aesthetic act mean, for instance? No. Now, these are complex ideas, but what I think in brief trying to say is that it is something completely different that when Abhinava is read Abhinava is read in his aesthetic works, one kind of parallel channel to when he's read in Pratyabhijna, the recognition or the epistemological works, and when he's read in the tantric works. No, they go parallelly, and the beauty unravels itself so magnificently. Now, I can only say that it might be appearing exaggerated, but I mean critically also, when you try to kind of read all of them together and try to see these mappings and try to establish these maps. How is aesthetics connected to epistemology, connected to whole metaphysics, connected to the tantric idea of ritual, and so on and so forth? How are they all connected? So if you kind of read them, which, I mean, I say I know only 5% of Abhinavagupta. It's very difficult. I've been trying for years, but if one can, then all this encompassing into, then you can write one book, which is, let's say, philosophy of Abhinavagupta or something, where all of this whole cartography, the mapping, it comes together, as one manifested theory, idea, or one pillar.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, I think this is a comment from Rajshri. I agree that it is his aesthetics that defines Abhinava. Having done my doctoral work on Abhinav Bharti, being a dancer myself, the Shiva Shakti Samarasya reveals itself in the Ananda Tandava in an instant.
That's fine.
Professor Jain?
I'm just mesmerized by this wonderful new world that is open for all of us to Professor Kaul's amazing, erudite, forceful, hypnotizing presentation.
No, thanks to you, sir. No, nothing.
Wonderful. My colleague is agreeing with me, Professor Mayador, something similar she just commented. And we would love to invite you, since you're not too far physically, we should have invited you physically in person here. I hope you'll agree to visit us at some point.
Sure, sure.
And,
My pleasure. My
I'd
pleasure.
love to be in touch with you. And thank you again from all of us at Flame University in Pune.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.